the left describes anything that's associated with the assumption that someone who's female, for example, will think in a female way. They regard that as an unreasonable prejudice. Yet they're perfectly reasonable to say that we need more women in X discipline because they will bring in female ideas. It's like, well, what the hell are female ideas? You can't have it both ways unless you're completely, unless you don't care at all about coherence or consistency, and ideologues really don't, because they care about putting their ideology forth. But the idea that you're going to get a diversity of ideas because you have a diversity of class of people assumes that ideas and identity are the same thing, and that's an absurd proposition. In fact, that's an essentially racist proposition. Black people think differently than white people. It's no, some do and some don't, and the overlap is substantive, and the difference between the individuals is far greater than the difference between the groups.
I think we also need to make a very clear distinction between discrimination and people that are just inclined to gravitate towards different careers and different focuses. There's a big difference between women being forced out of tech and women being not as compelled to enter into tech careers as men. But
yeah, well, the tech issue is a really interesting one for a couple of reasons. I mean, one is that, of course, high tech basically developed after the playing field for men and women was more or less leveled. I mean, that happened in the 1970s. And despite that, there aren't anywhere near as many women in tech. There's far more women in caring professions. And you see that particularly in Scandinavia, where they've done everything they can to equalize the playing field. It's 20-to-1 female to male nurses and 20-to-1 male to female engineers.
Explain that if you could, the Scandinavia issue, because it's very interesting what they've done over there and what the results have been.
Yeah, well, imagine that there are two reasons that people differ. There are more than two, but just imagine for the time being that there are two. One is for environmental reasons, cultural reasons, and the other is for biological reasons. What happens if you flatten out the environmental reasons, which is what's happened in Scandinavia, is you maximize the biological differences. You don't get rid of them, you maximize them. And so what's happened in Scandinavia is that men and women are more different from a temperament and personality perspective, and also in terms of their interests. They're more different in Scandinavia than they are anywhere else in the world.
Now, what have they done to try to flatten things out, as you say?
Well, they've transformed their social policies so that men and women have as close to equal opportunity, say, as any society has managed. But that hasn't produced the hoped-for equality of outcome. Quite the contrary. In many situations, it's exaggerated it. And you could say that that's actually okay, is that what you want is to have a society where the genuine differences between people are free to manifest themselves. So, for example, if you have 3 or 4 kids, say, the kids are going to be different from one another genetically. That's why they're not identical twins. They differ genetically. And if you set the environment up so that each child is supportive, the children actually turn out quite differently. Now, if you're an absolute brute and you beat them and you abuse them, then they'll all turn out the same because there's tremendous environmental influence on them then. But if you form an individual relationship with each of them and allow their strengths to manifest themselves as they will in a supportive environment, then the kids are going to turn out very different. And so a free society is actually one that produces massively unequal outcomes because it allows the genuine differences between people to manifest themselves. These people who are pushing equity, which is equality of outcome, that's what the word equity codes for, by the way, equality of outcome and not equality of opportunity. I don't know what in the world they do with regards to the fact that a very large number of professions are, high quality, high pay professions are female dominated. Physicians, for example, psychologists, any of the disciplines that have to do with human care are almost inevitably dominated by women, and that's increasingly the case. Is we're supposed to stop that? Is that also a sign of oppression? We're going to force women to do things they're not interested in?
Well, there's also a very disingenuous way of framing it here in America where people consistently, even the President of the United States, Obama, was talking about income inequality. And the way they frame income inequality, they talk about the 79 cents to the dollar. But what they don't discuss is that we're talking about completely different careers. We're not the way they frame it, they frame it as if two people are working side by side. One is a man, one is a woman. They're both doing the same job. The man makes $1, the woman makes 79 cents. Yeah. That is not the case.
Well, it's typical of ideological conversation, because what happens technically, like imagine that we talked about poverty a few minutes ago, and we said, well, there's many reasons that one person might have more money than another. There are many, many reasons why women might make less money on average than men. There are small businesses that women run, for example, make far less money than the small businesses that men run. But that's partly because a lot of women run their businesses part-time because they have kids. It's also partly because men do all the horrible, dangerous jobs, the ones where there's a high chance of dying. Men are much more likely to work outside. Men are much more likely to move in pursuit of a career opportunity. There are lots of reasons that men and women differ in terms of their income. But if you're an ideologue, you can only handle one variable. Oh, men and women measured en masse don't have the same incomes. Therefore, the system is corrupt.
Right.
Jesus, how much thinking does it take to come up with a theoretical scenario like that? It's so boneheaded, and it just pushes the ideological, it just pushes the ideology forward with no thought.
Now, as a professor, why is this sort of objective reasoning and really absolutely honest assessment of this situation, why is this so rare amongst professors? Why is this so rare in universities? Why is this such an unusual subject?
Well, I think the reason is that when people first encounter a complex topic like income differences, it's like, imagine you were drawing a map of a territory and you don't know the territory very well. The first thing you do is just roughly sketch out the shapes of the continents. And maybe you're wrong, like the early European maps of North America. You know, you kind of get one coastline right and you guess in the rest. It's blurry and gray. And then as you investigate more and more, your picture of the situation becomes higher and higher and higher and higher in resolution. It's hard to go from a low-resolution representation to a high-resolution representation. And ideologies are low-resolution representations. So the thing about a low-resolution representation is it looks like it covers everything. But it doesn't. The closer you look, the more details there are. You know, if you get a 3-year-old to draw a helicopter, they put like a little cross on the top and a circle and a stick and another circle, and that's the helicopter. Well, you know when you look at it that it's a helicopter. But no one would expect that thing to fly. If you want to change that into a real model of a helicopter, you have to increase your focus and concentration on every single element of the entity. And that takes a tremendous amount of cognitive effort. And sometimes you don't even know what you don't know about something. You know, I could say, well, there are 50 reasons why men and women's income differ. Well, that doesn't mean I can say all 50 of those differences. And each of those 50 differences are fragmentable into maybe another dozen categories each. Maybe there's 600 reasons why men and women's salary differ. But you have to spend a tremendous amount of time paying attention and thinking to build your model of reality into that level of resolution. And basically what you do is default to temperamentally influenced ideologies. They give you a one-bit answer to everything. Why do men and women's salaries differ? Oppression. It's always the same thing, and it makes you feel like you know something. And people like that because they don't like the feeling that there's something they don't know. They don't like to be in chaos. That's basically chaos. They like to be in order, and order is where you know everything. So, and professors are no different than people, obviously, given that they're people. Maybe they're more intelligent on average. They're also more sheltered, I would say, in many ways on average. And they're also not challenged as often.
But it almost seemed like when I was watching some of the debates that you've engaged in, it almost seems like they're politicians. It almost seems like they're wetting their finger and going with the breeze. There's some conversations that you had that were just, I had to stop and rewind them because I couldn't believe the arguments. There was a woman, I don't know, it was was it a transgender man that you were having a discussion with that was saying that there's no difference, no biological difference in the sexes?
Yeah, no biological difference. He said that the scientific consensus for the last 4... I'm not sure. I don't believe so. He was a professor who taught transgender studies at the University of Toronto. And yeah, and he said outright that there were no biological differences between men and women and that was the scientific consensus. And he believed that he had the qualifications to say that because he was a historian of medicine, you know, which hardly qualifies as a scientist. Not that you have to be a scientist to notice that there are biological differences between men and women. It was very bizarre for me at that point in the last few months because I was under substantial pressure from the university to stop repeating my claim that I wouldn't use compelled pronouns to refer to people, because the university regarded that as against the university policies and also against the Ontario Human Rights Code, so also illegal. And as my employers, they're responsible for everything I say, whether or not there has been a complaint made, whether or not the consequence of my speech is intended or unintended, because that's built into the legislation. And believe me, that's coming your way, because this legislation spreads like mad. But on the one hand, I got 2 letters of warning from the university for refusing to use these compelled pronouns, which I regard as the ideological constructions of radical left-wingers. And this professor went on the agenda, this Ontario news show, and announced publicly that there were no biological differences between men and women. It was like, you'd think maybe the university would have had something to say about that, since they do, in fact, have a biology department. But, oh no, that went by without notice. That was perfectly fine. It's insane.
It's such an insane thing to say. If there's no biological difference, then why are they taking hormones?
Well, that's a good question. Why bother with the surgery and especially the hormones?
Yeah.
Because that's not, like, you could argue with surgery that that's cosmetic.